In an era of slowing growth, Africa is home to a $1 trillion resource-rich economy and 6 of the 10 fastest-growing markets in the world. Success in Africa introduces the ambitious CEOs who are building the continent. These stories of growth, technology and tradition bring to life one of the most important stories of the global economy, a successful Africa. Jonathan Berman, author of the recently published book, joined us earlier in studio for more.
What I'm hoping to achieve actually is a couple things. One is to bring that story to an audience that doesn't have it. You know, those of us who work in Africa all the time know this story. Every plane we get on is full of people living that story. But when you get off that plane and transfer for a plane that's going to Beijing or going to New York, you're in a different world. And that's what I found, is after 10 years of doing work in Africa and participating in this Success in Africa story, when I would get on the plane to go home, I would find myself surrounded by people who didn't know that story at all, who knew Africa as a land of happy animals and miserable people.
Right. And also possibly also know Africa for its mineral wealth and still think whatever's going on is probably a commodity boom that's going to bust at some point.
Exactly right. So that Africa is a place where you can only extract value, not a place where you can build value.
Understanding that this is a series of insights from different CEOs operating on the continent, how do you go about choosing who contributes to this book?
So there are many, many more successful CEOs in Africa than I could have possibly covered in the book. What I looked for were CEOs who, first of all, were operating at scale, because I want people to know that the African business is about more than small and medium businesses, important as they are. So big businesses that are productive, competitive enterprises. I think another misconception that people have globally is that African business is about political relationships and essentially capturing them for rent seeking. Right. And I wanted people to see that there are these large, highly productive, competitive, globally ready enterprises across the continent. And so that's the people that are in the book. I think one further dimension to it is that as I talked to people around the continent, they were very interested in whether I was going to define success in Africa just in financial terms. And I think very few people in Africa do. And therefore, the CEOs that are in the book, you'll find to a man and woman are in some way creating what I'll call social wealth across the continent.
Of course, one of the really interesting things about the continent when you look at it from off the continent is that it's still almost seen as one singular mass or one singular market. Is that something that you really had to take on and actually really get into the grips of a 55-nation continent?
Yeah, as you know, as you'll see, there's a whole chapter in Success in Africa on is there an Africa? And it's something that I confronted quite a bit when I wrote the book. Is it fair to even write a book about all of Africa?
Yeah.
The way I perceive it is that Africa is a whole, but a differentiated whole. For a long time, I think people outside of Africa painted it with one brush, and that was bad for Africa. But in fact, in some ways, that's good for Africa today. For one thing, it's not. If you only looked at it in terms of the national markets, almost all those markets would be too small for a major global investor or a major global corporate to think about. And so it's worthwhile for them to think about it as Africa as a whole. But I also found as I went forward that the African CEOs that I know and that are in the book, their ambition, especially younger African CEOs, is large, is continental at the least. You know, they may approach it serially, they may approach it region by region, but there's a perspective there that is indeed Pan-African, and that's why I think it's worthwhile to think of it as a whole.
Were there any interesting insights that you didn't expect that really stood out for you as the book came together?
Well, that was one of them, right? Is the degree to which I'll call it the rising class of African chief executives think about Africa holistically, right? But a second one is that the map of Africa is shifting quite a bit. And I'll give just one example. North Africa is much more a part of Africa than I think most people think about today. You know, there is not an international institution or really an international corporation that doesn't just hive off North Africa as a separate and distinct entity. It is different than the rest of Africa, than much of the rest of Africa, but the similarities and the increasing interaction is quite significant. The role of, for example, Attijara Wafa Bank, the largest bank in North Africa, their role in growing out finance throughout Francophone West Africa is significant, and they're just one of several companies. Cevital, the largest company in Algeria, is investing significantly south. Increasingly, the North looks south for growth.
Any common concerns that seem to resonate with the contributors in this book?
I think for the contributors, both African and non-African, the interaction with government is much on their mind. Now, outside of Africa, I think most people's first question is, isn't Africa just horribly corrupt? And of course, there are transparency issues in Africa, as there are in my own country, right, in the United States. But I think that to a man and woman, as they talked about their relationship with government, they talked about the process of growing a closer and more effective collaboration between business and government across the continent. And that, in fact, is what I think you see, with changes and variations depending on which of those 55 countries you're talking about.
Right.
As a whole, what you see is a trend of government-business collaboration that's actually driving a steadily better environment for business.
Oftentimes you pick up publications that talk about how to do business in Africa with all sorts of insights and advice. Do we get a sense here of how not to do business in Africa?
Yeah, I think you do. There are a few lessons learned that were hard along the way.
Yeah.
I think a number of companies, and so I'll just list off a couple of them. I think a number of companies coming into the continent from outside have done so in sort of a half-bet way. They've done a lot of pilot projects, small projects, and I think what the Chinese experience demonstrates is that that's probably not the best way to go about it. That it is worthwhile taking your time to make a decision about being in Africa, but then once there, it takes a rather significant commitment of intent and also of personnel, because you need to have people on the ground who are making the decision, and also of capital. The other is the other most important ingredient, I would say, that is the difference between success and failure, is time horizon. Though these are fast growth markets, a fast buck is not what's made here.
Right.
In general, investing in frontier markets, as in Africa now, as was true in China and Brazil before it, is a decade-long venture.
It's about patient capital.
That's right, that's right. And that doesn't necessarily need to mean sub-market returns,
right,
but it does mean that the long-term investor and the long-term corporate player are the ones that win in the end.
Jonathan, if you were to take the total contributions in the book, what would you say of the sentiment about the future of doing business in Africa?
Yeah, it's remarkable that every one of the CEOs who participated in the book, including those from outside Africa, have this fundamentally optimistic picture of Africa. In part because it's over the long term. There are short-term vicissitudes in each one of the countries in which these companies are active. But if they look at the long-term fundamentals on the continent, they are sort of unambiguously in favor, forward-looking and positive about the investment they've made.
Understanding that you're going to have a couple more launches on the continent, wishing you the best of luck for that. But should a person watching the show now want to get their hands on a copy of this book, where exactly do they get it?
I do hope they go out and get success in Africa. It's available on Amazon and also on Kalahari.